What is up, bodyweight warriors, and welcome back to another video and another episode of the Do It Right series, this time sponsored by Skillshare. It's been a little while since we've done another episode of the Do It Right series. This is a series in which we break down the most important flexibility positions. We go through what people commonly make mistakes in doing, because flexibility training, much like strength training, there is a technique, there is an importance with certain form cues that will make a difference. I then share a couple of exercises with you that I would personally recommend trying and making the main focus of your training. And today, that is going to be focused on the front split. All right, without further ado, let's jump into the mistakes, the things that I commonly see people do, which is going to be holding back their progress when it comes to training the front split, or certainly making their life harder. So the first mistake that I see people make, and this probably is the most common one, and that is the overemphasis of the hamstring flexibility when it comes to achieving the front split. This usually ends up happening because of how people set up in their front split position. When they set up in their front split, they've got hands on the floor, they slide out, and they end up having this forward lean in their torso position, which ultimately means it's going to put more strain and more stress over the hamstring. The then logical conclusion is, because you're feeling the majority of the stretch in the hamstring, that the hamstring's the problem. We need to get more flexible hamstrings to achieve the front split, which, isn't necessarily wrong, but it kind of ignores the fact that if you perform the front split differently, that wouldn't be the same issue. When it comes to achieving a full front split, we want to focus the majority of our attention to opening up the hip flexors and improving that hip extension, as that's ultimately the easiest way to get the cleanest and easiest front split. So a very simple adjustment that we could make to avoid this first mistake is simply performing a front split stretch in a more upright, a more vertical torso position. So basically, when you're doing your front split, just grab some supports, whether that's yoga blocks, whether that's some chairs, something to place your hands on so you can keep that torso upright and almost think about leaning back into the stretch. And then from here, actually trying to think about reaching out forward with the foot, trying to push the foot away from you. This should dramatically change the feeling of the stretch. It's going to take off that intensity of the hamstring, and it's going to place more emphasis on the hip flexor. The second mistake is one that I would consider more trying to cheat your front split than much of a full mistake, and that is twisting at the hips when it comes to the front split. Now, oftentimes what you'll see is basically as people get closer and closer down to the floor, they're trying to squeeze out those last few inches, then they begin to open up at the hips, they twist at the hips, that back leg seems to shift backwards, open up, and that allows you to get a little bit deeper down into the stretch. But for the flexibility purists out there, we'd argue that that isn't really a proper technical front split. In a full front split position, we want to maintain nice squared hips. This is going to increase the demand for flexibility at both the hamstring and the hip flexor, but ultimately is a better position. The only real way to implement this is just to really be aware of how your hip positioning is, take videos, take pictures, and have a look at how your form is. We want to kind of think of pulling that front leg, that front hip back into the socket, and we want to think about engaging the glute on the back leg to drive that hip forward and get that squaring of the hips. The third and final mistake is not training this with enough intensity. Now, this seems to be a common mistake for flexibility in general. People like to do things nice and easy and go a little bit more relaxed with their flexibility training, which has its place and is absolutely useful. But when it comes to these hard and more intense positions, often I'd like to see people train it more like strength training and less like stretching. Now, for full details on this, I would recommend checking out the video, which I'll link in the description down below, which talks about how often to train flexibility. But essentially, train it hard, train it a couple of times a week, think 3, 4, 5 sets, and then do a little bit light greasing the groove in between to help things ticking along. Speaking of doing things right, I just want to share a quick message from today's sponsor, which is Skillshare. If you didn't know, Skillshare is an online learning platform. It's got thousands of classes from people who actually do this for a job. They know how to do things right, and you can learn from them. Whether you're just a dabbler, do it as a hobby, or if you're a professional like myself and creating stuff is your job, there is a class at pretty much any level. I've actually started the class by MKBHD, Marcus Brownlee, who is a massive YouTuber on this platform. I'm a massive fan of his tech videos, and I thought I'd take his class to try and improve my own ability to create better content here on YouTube. Skillshare is offering the first 1,000 of my subscribers who use the link in the description down below a free 1-month trial to Skillshare, so you can start exploring your creativity and learning new skills today. Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Right, so now we know what not to do. Now, how do we do it right? What exercises could we use to get closer to achieving the front split. I'm gonna share 2 exercises with you today. Number 1 is basically how to stretch the hip flexors more intensely. And the one I'm going to share with you today is an Emmett Lewis inspired one, in which he would say that it helps you to see through time. And that is the overhead hip flexor stretch. Now for this one, we're going to want to set up in a normal wall hip flexor stretch. So we're going to place that knee relatively close to the wall. The closer we go, the harder it is. The further away, the slightly less intense it is. Foot up, and get ourselves into a lunge position with a light weight, maybe around 5 kilos to start with, working your way up in the hand. From here, we're going to lower into a lunge position, making sure to maintain as much as possible that posterior pelvic tilt or that tucked position during this stretch. This is when you're going to notice a pretty deep stretch over the hip flexor and also into the abdominals as well. The reason we have this overhead position is because it kind of forces you and makes you think about actively trying to remain upright in this stretch position. Something that we talked about, there's one of the most important things. The first mistake that people do is they fold forward. It's pretty much impossible to do this in this overhead position. That being said, it is pretty intense. If it is too intense for you, then the easier option would be performing this in a front rack position. So that's holding the weight on your shoulder. Again, it's going to make it very hard for you to fold forward without this becoming extremely challenging. From here, we want to think about squaring the hips. We want to think about pulling that front leg back into the hip socket, and we want to think about engaging the glute and using that back leg glute to kind of drive the hip down and forward deeper into the stretch. Now we can just hold this position. We can hold it 30, 45, 60 seconds, perform it for a few sets, or we can perform this one as reps. Think 6 to 10 repetitions, lowering down slowly, using the glute to drive the hip forward and open the hips further. After you've done those reps, I would generally add a short hold on the last repetition. This one for me is maybe we could use as a warm-up, but also if you just have stubborn hip flexors, it's something you could spend time doing and holding, because it's going to help break down and peel back a lot of those layers of fascia that are the hip flexor. Alternatively, I'll link down below to the hip flexor do it right episode, and I'll also link to the 5-minute hip flexor stretch, both of which will help you improve your hip flexor stretching. Right, so that's kind of going to unlock the hip flexors a bit, but what do we want to do when it comes to specific front split stretching? And that is with kind of the bread and butter of front split work, which in my opinion is the long lunge. Now the long lunge is really what it says on the tin. It is a lunge position that you try to go as long with the feet as you can. First of all, think about setting the hips, pulling that front leg back into the socket, engaging the glute, pushing that front hip forward, squaring them off nice and steady. Upright with the torso, making sure we get a nice deep stretch over the hip flexor, and then just begin to wiggle or let that rear leg slide out backwards deeper into the stretch. Basically, we can just focus on trying to keep moving that back leg back, and eventually we move from what would be a lunge position to kind of a bent leg front split sort of position hold. It's a pretty intense stretch, and also we're getting actively stronger through that entire range of motion. If you still feel like you have more range to give at this point, I personally like to place a support under the calf of the front leg and then move to a supported front split active hold. This is essentially the same deal as the long lunge, it's just with the front leg straight instead. Again, the same principle applies. We can just keep sliding that back foot back until eventually we hit the front split. The main reason I really like this drill is it really emphasizes the engagement of the glute on the back leg. It's very, very hard to hold this position without actively engaging the glute and some of that posterior chain to pull the torso upright to get more stretch over the hip flexor, which is the fundamental part of the front split. Now you can perform this one for hold times, much like the first one, 30, 45, 60 seconds. And during that hold time, we're going to try and elongate and drop lower into that stretch position. You can also perform this one for repetitions. Again, 6 to 10 reps. I would pause for maybe 3, 4, 5 seconds on each repetition. A nice active position, and then lower back down, resting the knee on the floor. But as we said beforehand, I would add a pause on that last rep of maybe 15 to 20 seconds. As with mistake number 3, we want to treat these like strength training. 3 to 5 sets for these twice a week, and you should see some pretty good gains in your hip flex flexibility, but also your progress towards front split. But that is basically the end of this Do It Right episode. If you want some more specific routines, then there is always the 2 follow-alongs that are available on this channel. There is a more advanced one and a more beginner one. I'll link to those in the description down below. Whilst you're down there, there is also the link to my app Tribe, in which we have a whole host of flexibility programs. There's 5 levels for the front split in there, from nothing to the front split, as well as routines for handstands, strength, and more. Again, link to that will be in the description down below. But now I want to pass the question on to you guys. Is there a particular drill or set of drills that you like for developing front split? Or have I missed anything that people commonly make mistakes with their front split training? Please let me know, join the conversation. with a comment in the comment section down below. If you just enjoyed this video, then you can hit that thumbs up button and support the channel. Right next to it is that subscribe button if you want to join the Bodyweight Warrior tribe. Don't miss out on any more future videos. But that has basically been it for this week, guys. I'll catch you in the next episode. Have a strong week and